The young and the restless spoiler's shock, everything had already begun to spiral the moment Damian and Lily stopped hiding. For weeks they had exchanged glances in silence, brushing past each other in corridors with that magnetic pull of two people trying to resist something inevitable. But once they crossed the line, there was no turning back. The facade crumbled, the restraint disappeared, and soon they were inseparable, open, unashamed, even bold in their intimacy. They laughed together in public, held hands at the Chancellor Winter's offices, kissed without worry of who might see. But for all the passion they shared, there was one pair of eyes that burned every time they were near Cane's. At first, he tried to ignore it. He told himself that Lily had moved on before, that this was just another phase, another rebound from the wreckage he had left behind. But each time he saw Damian place his hand on the small of Lily's back, or whisper something that made her tilt her head back and laugh in that familiar, radiant way, something inside Cane fractured a little more. The pain mutated into anger, and anger into obsession. It wasn't just about losing Lily anymore. It was about being humiliated. Replaced. Forgotten. He had convinced himself he was fighting for love, but it had become about power, about control. And with each passing day, he saw his place in Lily's life erode while Damian carved out a future that had once belonged to him. It wasn't supposed to be like this. Lily had once been his. He had memorized her, breathed her in, walked through fire for her. And now she was tossing all of that away for someone like Damian? No. Cane couldn't accept it. Wouldn't accept it. And so he stopped trying to win her back. He started planning something else. Something far darker. Lily didn't realize how far gone Cane had become until it was too late. They had just left a benefit gala together, arm in arm, glowing with the newness of their love. They were laughing over a private joke, waiting by the valet stand, when the world suddenly turned cold and disorienting. She remembered the sharp prick in her neck, the flash of black leather gloves, Damian shouting her name. And then everything faded. When she awoke, the air was stale, the walls concrete, and Damian lay unconscious a few feet away. She screamed his name until he stirred, groggy, confused. The room had no windows, just a steel door bolted shut. Then the lights flickered on, and Cane stepped into view, calm as a shadow, his eyes empty. At first, she thought it was a joke. A sick, twisted outburst from a man scorned. But when she saw the wildness in his expression, the broken rhythm of his breath, she knew. This wasn't a man asking for another chance. This was a man unraveling. Damian tried to reason with him, tried to appeal to whatever shreds of humanity Cane had left, but Cane wasn't listening. He paced like a predator, rambling about betrayal, about being erased, about how the world would see now that Lily had chosen wrong. His voice was ice one moment, fire the next, and Lily knew they weren't getting out of there unless she played it right. She begged him to stop, told him he was scaring her, that this wasn't who he was. But Cane just smiled, a tight, joyless curl of the lips, and said he was finally showing them who he really was. Lily's voice cracked as she told him she loved Damian. Not as some provocation, but as a final truth. She told him that even if he killed them both, she would still die loving Damian. That Cane had been her past, but Damian was her heart now. The words hung in the air like a challenge. And something snapped. Without a word, Cane pulled a knife from behind his back. Damian lunged to protect Lily, but Cane was faster. He drove the blade into Damian's chest with the force of all his heartbreak, all his jealousy, all his rage. The sound was wet and final. Damian gasped, collapsed, and Lily's scream shattered the silence. She scrambled to his side, pressing her hands to the wound, sobbing, screaming his name. But his eyes had already gone dull. Cane stood there, panting, the knife dripping, his face devoid of remorse. He looked down at Lily as she cradled Damian's body, her hands shaking, her mouth trembling, her soul breaking. And then, as if waking from a dream, she looked up at him and spoke with a clarity that cut deeper than any blade. She told him he was a monster. That he wasn't a victim. That she would never forgive him. And then she swore she would make him pay. Cane backed away, suddenly unsure of himself. The enormity of what he had done began to sink in. He had crossed the threshold. There was no path back from this. He fled the room, locking the door behind him, leaving Lily trapped with the body of the man she loved. For hours, she screamed for help, tried to break down the door, wept over Damian's lifeless form. But no one came. When she was finally rescued, alerted by a tip Cane had made in some twisted attempt at redemption, the authorities found her dehydrated, blood-stained, and in shock. She said only 3 words when they pulled her from the darkness: he killed him. The trial that followed was swift, brutal, and public. The media descended like vultures, devouring every detail of the tragedy. The once respected Cane Ashby became a cautionary tale of obsession turned deadly. Lily testified, her voice hollow, her eyes distant. Amanda returned to represent the state, and her cross-examination of Cane was clinical and lethal. Devon sat silently in the gallery, unable to look away from the destruction that had unfolded. The sentence was life in prison without the possibility of parole. But for Lily, no punishment could bring Damian back. In the weeks that followed, she withdrew from the world. She left Genoa City, unable to bear the memories of what had happened. She stopped answering calls, stopped responding to emails, vanished into the quiet corners of the world to grieve in peace. Damian's funeral was small, private, beautiful. She didn't speak, she couldn't. She stood by the grave and let the silence speak for her. As for Cane, he rotted behind bars, consumed by the very ghosts he had created. He saw Lily every night in his dreams, not the woman who had once loved him, but the woman whose life he had shattered. And every night, Damian stared back at him with hollow eyes, silent, accusing. There are some acts that damn a man forever. Some lines, once crossed, that can never be undone. And for Cane, love had never been enough to save him. It had only been the weapon that destroyed everything. The silence in the room was heavier than death. Damian's body lay motionless in the pool of blood that spread slowly across the cold floor, its crimson edges seeping beneath Lily's lifeless hand. Her face was pale, her body crumpled beside the man she had loved, her breathing shallow and unconscious. The room had gone still, but Cane stood motionless, the knife still gripped in his trembling hand, blood drying at the edge of the blade, and on his skin, and somewhere deep inside the corners of his fractured soul. The echoes of Lily's screams still rang in his ears, though her voice had long since gone silent. The madness that had overtaken him moments earlier, that raw, volatile rage that drove the steel into Damian's chest, had now receded into a kind of blank numbness. And now, in the cold aftermath, came the question that would not stop circling his mind: what now? He stared at Lily's still form. Her hair was matted with blood, Damian's blood, and her face was twisted in anguish even in unconsciousness. She had collapsed from the shock, from the horror, from the trauma of witnessing a man she loved slaughtered in front of her eyes by someone she once trusted, once shared a life with, once even forgave. Cane's breathing grew ragged, and the walls of the room seemed to close in tighter with every passing second. This wasn't how it was supposed to be. He had only wanted her to listen, to understand, to remember what they once had. He had never intended to go this far, or maybe he had. Maybe the part of him that still seethed with rejection and humiliation had wanted this all along. He dropped the knife with a sharp metallic clatter that reverberated across the room like a death knell. His legs buckled slightly, and he stumbled backward, pressing himself against the wall as if trying to disappear into it. He buried his face in his hands, his mind screaming in chaos. He was no longer in control. He hadn't been in control for a long time. The delusion of reclaiming Lily, of rewriting their story, had driven him off a precipice, and now he was dangling over the edge, holding on to nothing but the weight of what he had just done. But the question wouldn't go away. Lily was still alive. And when she woke, she would tell the world. She would destroy him with the truth. All it would take was one phone call. One name spoken aloud. And he would be finished. Gone. Erased. His eyes opened slowly, and they fell on her again. Lily, the woman he had loved for what felt like a lifetime, now curled on the floor beside a corpse, soaked in horror. And he wondered, with a kind of detached calculation, whether killing her would be mercy or madness. If he let her live, he was condemning himself. There would be no hiding, no redemption. She would scream his name into every courtroom, every headline, every whispered conversation in Genoa City. His children would hear. His name would be blackened beyond recognition. But if he killed her, if he ended it now, then there would be silence. No witnesses. No trial. Just two lovers gone in the dark. And he would vanish. Or try to. The thought made him nauseous, but he couldn't stop it. His feet moved slowly toward her, almost against his will, and he crouched beside her, watching her chest rise and fall in shallow gasps. Her eyelashes fluttered. Her lip trembled slightly. She was waking. And that moment, that sliver of time between unconsciousness and waking horror, felt like the longest moment of Cane's life. He could already imagine her eyes opening wide with terror, her mouth opening to scream his name again, her body scrambling backward in desperation. And he didn't know what he would do when that moment came. Would he reach for the knife again? Would he silence her? Or would he fall at her feet and beg for forgiveness that would never come? His hand hovered near her throat, but it trembled too much to follow through. He looked at his fingers, bloodied, shaking, unsteady, and then at her face. The memories came uninvited. Her laugh in their old kitchen, the way she used to whisper his name late at night, the way she forgave him once when no one else would. And for the first time, he realized she was never going to forgive him again. This wasn't something she could forget. This wasn't one more lie or betrayal. He had crossed a sacred line, shattered something pure. He had become what he once swore he'd never be, dangerous. Irredeemable. Lily stirred, her eyelids fluttering as reality crept back in. She groaned softly, then tensed as the metallic smell of blood hit her senses. When she opened her eyes, the horror returned in a wave. She saw Damian again. She saw Cane. She saw everything. And she screamed, not just in fear, but in grief so raw it cracked the air like lightning. Cane jumped back, hands up, as if her voice had struck him like a blow. She pushed herself back against the wall, her eyes wild, her body shaking uncontrollably. She screamed that she would call the police, that she would never stop until he paid. But she didn't need to say it. He already knew. Cane stood there for a moment, staring at her, at the carnage, at the horror he had created, and then he turned and fled. He ran not just from the room but from the truth of what he had done. Down the hallway, through the shadows, into the night. His soul trailing behind him like a blood-soaked echo, forever stained by the moment he chose vengeance over love. And Lily, broken and screaming, crawled toward the nearest wall, found the emergency button Cane hadn't known existed behind the baseboard, and slammed it with all her strength. Sirens wailed in the distance, and salvation came. But it came too late for Damian, and far too late for Cane. Because even if the law took him, even if the prison gates swallowed him whole, there would never be enough time, enough punishment, to atone for the moment he became something less than human. When he let darkness consume him, and left nothing behind but blood, silence, and a love that had already died long before Damian ever did. In the days following the blood-soaked nightmare in Paris, as Lily remained in critical condition under sedation and the forensic team continued to catalogue the horrors of that sealed ballroom, Devon found himself unable to accept the story as it had been presented. The authorities had pinned everything on Cane, and on the surface, it made sense. A man broken by jealousy, consumed by obsession, culminating in a murder so brutal it had shaken even the most hardened detectives. But Devon had known Cane too long, too deeply, to believe that the man he once called brother-in-law had acted entirely on impulse. Something felt orchestrated. Too perfect. Too theatrical. And when Devon replayed the events in his mind over and over, he began to see not chaos, but choreography. Cane's behavior, the timing, the very setting of the event itself. It all felt like a diversion. And once Devon allowed that possibility to take root, everything began to shift. He began to suspect that the Paris trip had never been about celebration or closure. It had been about control. Containment. A meticulously executed distraction. What if Cane hadn't just wanted to punish Lily and Damian? What if that was just the visible piece of a much larger and darker operation? What if every guest, every ally, every rival in that ballroom had been handpicked not for their relationship to Cane, but for their relevance to someone else entirely? Devon couldn't shake the feeling that someone else had been pulling the strings all along. And when he brought up this theory to Amanda in a hushed conversation behind closed doors, her reaction only deepened his suspicion. She didn't deny it. In fact, her words were sharp and calculated, almost rehearsed, as if she had already prepared for this confrontation. Even if that's true and I knew everything, she said, her eyes steady and unflinching, why would I tell you any of it? That single sentence unraveled more truth than Amanda had intended. Devon knew her well enough to recognize when she was protecting something, or someone. Her refusal to confirm anything only confirmed everything. Amanda wasn't just a bystander. She was either involved in something deeper, or she had uncovered it and was now in too deep to turn back. And if that was the case, then the real threat hadn't been Cane. It had been whoever Cane was working for. Or pretending to be. The name Aristotle Dumas had been whispered before, tied to offshore accounts, silent takeovers, and inexplicable disappearances in the global finance world, but no one had ever confirmed his identity. He was a ghost story among billionaires. A man who appeared only in rumors and coded transfers. And yet, Devon couldn't ignore how often Cane's name had recently been connected to Dumas's signature deals. It was as if the two men had become interchangeable. And maybe, Devon began to realize, that was the point. What if Cane wasn't Dumas, but merely the mask he wore? What if this entire time, the world had been watching the wrong man? It was around that time that Devon turned his attention to Holden Novak. A charming, unassuming businessman with a penchant for quiet influence. Holden had attended the Paris gala, and had conveniently disappeared just before the chaos began. Devon had never liked coincidences. As he began to dig, he found patterns. Holden's financial interests aligned far too often with projects linked to Cane, or rather, to Dumas. Transactions in Nice. Shell companies based in Morocco. Confidential meetings in Vienna. And beneath it all, a web of communication that traced back to encrypted networks Devon had only seen used in military intelligence. It was all there, hiding in plain sight. The realization hit him like a freight train. Holden wasn't a guest. He was a handler. A liaison. Still working under Aristotle Dumas, or worse, still working under the real Dumas while Cane pretended to play the part. The implications were staggering. If Cane had never truly been Dumas, then the entire Paris event. The murder, the panic, the lockdown, had been a calculated act of misdirection. While everyone was consumed by the bloodshed, by Lily's screams and Damian's death, something else had happened behind the scenes. And no one had thought to look. Amanda, for her part, remained tight-lipped, but Devon saw the panic flicker in her eyes every time the name Dumas was spoken aloud. He noticed how she stopped answering certain questions. How she changed the subject when he mentioned Holden. And when Devon confronted her about Cane's supposed confinement in Nice, how he had told everyone he couldn't leave the estate, how he'd insisted they were all trapped, Amanda didn't even bother to deny the lie. The fact that Cane had reappeared in Genoa City the following week proved he had always had the means to leave. Which meant the guests in Paris hadn't been trapped by circumstance. They had been detained. Intentionally. held in place while something else, something bigger, was executed elsewhere. Devon couldn't shake the idea that somewhere, during the chaos, a transfer had occurred. A shipment moved. A document signed. A life erased. Perhaps even a government infiltrated. The bloodshed had served its purpose, to mask the real crime, to keep eyes off the true objective. And now, Cane was either in hiding, or worse, had been disposed of by the very man he had impersonated. In Genoa City, the atmosphere shifted dramatically. Amanda became more reclusive, refusing interviews and disappearing for days at a time. Holden returned from business abroad, but his stories were inconsistent and his alibis full of holes. The press fixated on the tragedy in Paris, but Devon was focused on the silence that followed. Someone powerful wanted the world to believe the horror had ended with Cane's breakdown. But Devon knew better. He could feel it in his bones, that the true orchestrator had yet to show his face. And so, while the city mourned, while Lily healed in isolation and the media hounded every whisper of the story, Devon began building his own network. Quietly, methodically. He reached out to allies who owed him favors. Hired investigators who specialized in tracking phantoms. He knew that if they were to survive whatever was coming next, he would have to expose the truth, however dangerous it might be. Because if Dumas was real, and Cane had been merely the illusion, then the real nightmare wasn't Paris. It was what came after.